the computer. Okay. And we are recording. Okay. Um, I want to welcome the classes watching this, going to be watching this on as part of their assignment. And this week, the master therapist interview is going to be with our own Alex Sturm. And she's a new assistant professor in the department. You may have met her. And she has an expertise in autism, now referred to as autism spectrum disorder. So we're going to be talking about that within our unit of individual diagnostic categories. Alex, just to orient you, we have different sections of the class, and one of them has been to go through all the major modalities of individual psychotherapy. So we did, ACT and DBT and CBT and contemporary dynamic therapies and somatic therapies and creative therapies. And then after that, we did non-individual modalities, non-individual modalities like family therapy, couple therapy, group therapy, and also looked at broader kind of cultural and community kinds of issues, beyond the individual. And so now in this unit, we're taking a couple of more diagnostic categories or individual issues, specific issues in psychotherapy. And one of them obviously is going to be our talk on ASD. And then I'm going to have another therapist come in who specializes in sort of gender issues, gender identity issues that are, so influential in our society. And we're seeing a lot of those issues come up in psychotherapy. So that's where the interview is placed. So maybe we can start, just by having a shared definition of autism or autism spectrum disorder.
Right. Well, first, hi, everyone. Autism spectrum disorder is what's called a neurodevelopmental disorder. So I don't know if you, Rich, have kind of defined what that means.
No.
But basically that means that the etiology begins at birth. So it's differences in the development of the brain and brain function that results in the phenotype of autism. So that means the behavioral presentation of autism. So it's not something that you magically get when you are in adolescence, for example, and many of you have probably learned about, this biopsychosocial model of anxiety and depression and how you might be at risk for development of an anxiety depression. Depending on your combination of your environment and your genes, you may or may not receive a diagnosis or eventually meet criteria. With autism spectrum disorder and other neurodevelopmental disorders such as ADHD, you are likely going to meet criteria. It's just at the point at which your environmental demand exceeds your own ability to kind of manage your environment. So
are you saying that some of these neurodevelopmental disorders, even though the likelihood of them being manifested in your life is almost a certainty, there is some difference in when the problems manifest themselves? Is it most likely very early in development?
It really depends. So in autism, autism is defined by two core deficits. So the first is social communication and the second is restricted or repetitive behaviors. So a person is likely showing or displaying restricted or repetitive behaviors early on, starting, in late infancy, I would say, through toddlerhood. Repetitive behaviors, though, are very normative through toddler years. As toddlers start to try and master new skills, the way that you master skills is by practicing them over and over and over again. So that's why toddlers exhibit a lot of repetitive behaviors, just typically.
Yeah.
In terms of social communication, though, social communication demands increase substantially over the course of development. So while you're in elementary school and the social demands are primarily on the playground. So do you know
Right.
the rules of a game? Can you play in the game? Can you make everybody pleased with your performance in the game? There's not the nuance of the communication that's demanded when you're in college or high school, for example, where relationships all of a sudden become really based on communication and sharing of feelings and affect. So they're a lot more demanding. Relationships are much more demanding in
Yeah, I mean,
adolescence.
in development, normal development or typical development, some of the cognitive issues that we'll talk about later that are associated with autism, such as the ability to mentalize or have metacognition, really don't kick in until early middle childhood.
Yeah.
And so you're saying that those deficits wouldn't be manifest until those kinds of processes become normative and you would see the difference.
Yes, exactly. So, depending on the area of, social development or even kind of brain development, it's highly normative depending on certain times of your life, basically. So, this is what a neurodevelopmental disorder is. You're going through changes, you're changing as a person, your behavior is changing, and that behavior is also defined by what's happening in your environment. So we can talk about, socially conforming and non-conforming behavior. At some point, behavior is socially conforming and then it becomes non-conforming. So those changes in how behavior is defined also influences timing of diagnosis.
Right. So you could have a child that has um, has ASD, but it doesn't become manifest to in the social environment until later. In a
Yeah,
way, I could see that being good and bad. I
yeah.
mean, in a way, they get a sense of being normative and not being signaled out. But in another way, it precludes early intervention that may have made the problem less if it had been known in advance.
Yeah, and often a child who will go on to meet criteria for autism, they still may feel or be treated a little bit differently than their peers. It's remarkable how early kids can detect when a child is behaving a little differently than they would expect.
Yeah.
This is true even for my son who's 20 months old. If another kid on the playground is doing something that he's like, oh, I'm not comfortable with what's happening here, he knows it immediately and he turns in the other direction and walks away. So that's 20 months. Like, that's
Yeah.
crazy.
I mean, this is a crazy thought too. Have they ever used these kinds of peer reactions or sociograms at a very early age to try and identify kids who might be, on the spectrum at a later point? And
No, and that's an interesting thought. The only studies they've done of peer responses are in like vignettes, basically. So they describe behaviors through vignettes and ask people to make judgments about the person. So that's the only way that they've done that.
I mean, I think that's a fascinating possibility
Yeah.
to take kids, let's say in preschool, and to have some kind of sociogram, even a concrete one, where they can move around figurines to see who's close to each other and who's in the inner circle and who's on the outside, and whether or not those kids that they place on the outside that may be functioning in somewhat of a normative level, that later on that is a predictor of some kind of behavioral problem or even possibly being on the spectrum.
Yeah, and the way that and that you're describing this, there has been kind of a way of measuring this, which is through peer nominations. I don't know if so. Peer nominations are you go into a school, an elementary school, for example, and you ask kids to say who their friends are and who their best friends are. And the kids with autism and also the kids with ADHD are less likely to be nominated by their peers
Right.
as a friend or a close friend. So um, and more likely also to be like isolated on the playground and things like that. So they've tried to measure this in other ways, but they've never quantified from the peer perspective what the peer's behavior is.
Mm-hmm.
So that is, I think, interesting. They've identified how the target child may be different in terms of peer nominations, but not how the peer behaves.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking at the peer nomination um, as a predictive variable.
Yes, yes. Peer nomination would definitely be a predictive variable, but it would not necessarily be just of autism. It would be of behavioral problems as well. So the kids with
Right.
ADHD, but the kids with ADHD, the ones who are more hyperactive, impulsive, are also um, receiving when they do this negative nomination. So it's most schools now don't allow you to ask kids who do not like in your classroom. They're not trying to encourage kind of negative perceptions of peers, but when they've done that in the past, the kids with ADHD or with more negative behaviors are getting nominated as people who are not liked. So negative nominations.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So let's double back a little bit. We have a sense of what the disorder is.
Yeah.
And what's the status of our knowledge about the biological bases of this genetic and biological?
So etiology and theories of cause are very complicated. They're only in about 25% of kids and adults, there's a single genetic cause. So there's a single gene mutation that we know causes the behavioral phenotype. These are genetic disorders that we know are associated with a phenotype of autism. But in 75% of cases, it's what's called polygenic risk factors. So there are a bunch of different genes and combinations of genes that result in potential diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that, there may have been environmental exposure in utero that may have caused some kind or triggered some kind of genetic mutation, for example.
Environmental exposure to what?
It could be maternal fever and illness. It could be nourishment. It could be pollution. It could be like pharmacology. It could be a bunch of different things. So they found all of those things to be linked in some respect. They also consider paternal age to be kind of an environmental factor. So women are prevented from having kids at a certain age because they go through menopause. Men can always have kids, but that doesn't mean their genes are just as virile as they were when they were 20.
Right.
So they have linked paternal age to an increased risk of a diagnosis of autism in a child.
For the ones that have this single genetic mutation,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of work being advanced now in gene editing, genetic engineering, using this CRISPR gene editing system. I don't know if you've looked at that at all, but in the case of a single gene, would it not be possible to edit that gene out?
Yeah, it's tricky though because these single gene mutations are really large, I guess I would say. So it's like an entire duplication of an enormous portion of the gene. I think also there's some blowback from the self-advocacy groups. So individuals who have a diagnosis of autism that advocate for disability rights, in that by making those decisions, you're making a decision to prevent the diagnosis of autism, which a lot of individuals on the spectrum don't see as bad. So it becomes difficult to talk about, well, what does a person's life mean if they have autism versus if they don't? Are they a better person if they don't have autism? A lot of self-advocates would disagree with that. So yes, gene editing is a very hot topic for many reasons.
Right. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So any other biological kinds of things that you think we covered that?
Yeah, I mean, for an hour or so interview,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, we can go into that. Um, is the prevalence, you always hear that the prevalence of ASD has increased dramatically over the last few decades.
Yes.
Is that true? Is that an epiphenomena of better assessment, more attention to the disorder, or do you think that there's been an objective rise in prevalence?
I think for the most part, it's just a better ability of clinicians to diagnose. So more high functioning individuals. So by high functioning, I mean people who are verbally fluent, so no impact on language, even gifted language, no impact on cognition, so either normal or above average IQ, who are typically able to somewhat camouflage their behavior, their social deficits. So it's being in a social situation doesn't come naturally to everybody, and you have to learn some social nuances and social rules. And some individuals are just very good at learning social rules, but that means that there's a huge amount of cognitive effort that's expended in order to be in a social situation. So for those individuals who may not have been diagnosed in the past, now they have an opportunity for diagnosis as people are better about diagnosing. Though there is some suggestion that and this is something that Temple Grandin talks about. She's an autistic self-advocate in addition to others, assortive mating. So you are generally attracted to people who are like you and interested in similar things. So if you have a restricted interest, for example, and you want to talk about Warhammer, board games for hours and hours, you want somebody else who's going to want to talk about Warhammer for hours and hours, right? So if you have two individuals who both have restricted interests and might both meet criteria for autism, the likelihood of them then having a child with autism is potentially higher because of the increased genetic load of risk factors.
There is a heritability.
What's that?
There's a heritability aspect to autism.
Yes, there's a large heritability aspect. Mm-hmm.
Right.
So a lot of parents of children on the spectrum are now being assessed, and we discover something called the broader autism phenotype. So not necessarily meeting criteria for autism, but having symptoms that might be characterized by the disorder.
Yeah.
So yes, assortative mating is a thing. And I would argue that now in our age of technology, when it's easier for us to make contact with people who are like us, there's maybe even more of that factor, not just in autism, but in other areas as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are people who have taken the position that there is a sort of an objective increase. I mean, you could say, even within the things that you're mentioning, that a sort of mating may have produced a rise. Maybe the use of technology that may have minimized some kind of physical attachment processes may have been a contributor, and all those teratogenetic effects, in utero effects, those may be more prevalent in modern society too.
Yeah, so they're more environmental triggers. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're more environmental triggers. Yeah, so I mean, so clearly it's that we're more knowledgeable about it, more aware of it. But is it possible that there are also some of these causal factors that have increased, which would lead to an objective increase? Look at the age of parenthood is going up. Yes,
no, it's very possible. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what do people usually quote as the incidence of spectrum disorders? How many people?
Well, the most recent release from the CDC on March 26th, that was 2 days ago, is 1 in 54. And then men or boys are 4 times more likely to be diagnosed than girls.
That's interesting too. Yeah. What do you make of that?
They've tried to do a lot of research in this area, and I think this is a new area of funding for funding organizations who are interested in autism research. They haven't been able to identify single reasons. One reason that I would say is one of the most accepted is that men just have a lower threshold for diagnosis. So women on average are more socially engaged, so are either putting themselves in situations and environments where their social skills are challenged, and as a result they're developing their social skills, or the nature argument, they're naturally born to be more communicative. So for a girl to meet the same criteria that a boy has to meet would mean that they have more significant impairment. So they might be able to get by without meeting diagnosis or
Right, right.
diagnostic
I mean, I was
criteria.
just going through my uh, sort of inventory of people that I've met and clients that I've met.
Mhm.
I can't really think of a female client that I've had that I would just assume was on the spectrum.
Yeah, it's sometimes really hard to diagnose girls, especially girls who are really high functioning or not or don't experience a lot of impairment.
Yeah.
They're more likely to have received other diagnoses earlier in life. So anxiety, depression, OCD, eating disorders, they're very good at camouflaging and socially masking. But if you talk to them about what their experience is like, it's very, very difficult for them to be in social situations.
Yeah.
They might, this phenomenon of, do they make eye contact? If they don't make eye contact, then they must have autism. Well, that's not true for everybody, right?
Yeah.
Some people on the
You could be
spectrum
socially anxious. Yeah.
make eye contact, right? So um, I've heard from professors, from clinicians that, we have like a shared client or something, and I say, I think this person might be on the spectrum, and they say, no, they couldn't be. Like, they're able to have conversations with me. We're able to talk. They're very insightful. We're able to talk about a lot of things. They couldn't possibly be on the spectrum. So, particularly for girls. So there still is a lot of misconception about what autism looks like in females, and particularly females who are not very impaired. But girls on the spectrum are more likely to be taken advantage of. They're more likely to put themselves in really dangerous situations because they don't know social expectations around certain situations. So girls on the spectrum who don't experience a lot of impairment related to their core deficits are very, very vulnerable still.
Right.
So I'm guessing that you have had, this is my way of saying, I'm guessing you have had
Right.
female clients come in and who would meet criteria or have in the past, who would be hard for you to be able to diagnose by not talking to them about their symptoms.
Right. So before we leave the biology and the etiology of it, I think I'd be remiss not to at least bring up the whole issue of vaccines and where we stand with that.
Vaccines do not cause autism, period.
Yeah.
The individual who published that original article and the individuals who have perpetuated that message have all retracted that opinion about the idea that vaccines cause
Wakefield
autism.
has retracted?
What's that?
Andrew Wakefield has retracted?
Well, I mean, I don't know that he's gone publicly in saying he's retracted, but he lost his medical license. And
I think he went to Texas. He's in some sort of small town in Texas, and he has kind of
a following. But a piece of this is he has to make a living still, you know what I mean? And he can't make a living as a licensed medical professional. So what are his options? His options are to create a following around this idea. So, whether it's something that he actually believes or something that allows him to make money, you have to understand. I mean, people have to make money. So he is unfortunately taking advantage or continues to take advantage of people, which is not good for his own benefit.
A lot of times when this issue of vaccines and the impact of vaccines, we sort of bifurcate people into being, supportive of vaccines or anti-vax and alarmists and everything. But I have to say, in talking to some people who are basically would follow the science and would appreciate that some of the hysteria about vaccines didn't have an empirical basis. I've heard this sort of middle ground position. I was wondering if you had heard this and what you think about it, which is that to look at that maybe even though vaccines don't cause autism, that it could be that we alter the protocol for vaccination, in that right now uh, in an efficiency model, a baby comes in to a pediatrician and gets, injected with all manner of things. They may be getting, 5 pathogens at one time.
Mhm.
And so this more compromised protocol is whether or not you would give all the vaccines
Yeah.
to the infant, but to do it more gradually and in multiple visits.
Yeah. So there has been no research around this in terms of causation in autism yet. I will say from personal experience, there is a lot of variability in infants' reactions to vaccines. So my child, for example, was distressed for like 7 days after his first round of vaccines. And subsequently, I had them spaced. So he was only receiving like, a couple vaccines at a time because I knew he would get over it, but I wasn't getting over it within 7 days. I was like, Mama has to be able to function. I can't like have you screaming for 7 days straight. So um, he was fine, as a result of the vaccines, but he was in distress. So much so that I, took my position with the pediatrician who said, there's no evidence to support that there's a problem with this. And I was like, well, I don't really care in terms of long term. I just need him to not be crying for 7 days.
Well, yeah, no, there's the impact of you,
Yeah.
but also the fact that he was crying
Yes.
indicated that there was something. He's not crying.
It's an indication that
ignoring.
something is wrong. Yeah.
Exactly.
Um, so yes, there's been no research about number of vaccines at a time and the resulting potential causal increase in risk for autism in terms of a behavioral and anecdotal level, and just
Yeah.
talking to peers about their children. That infants have different reactions.
I would, yeah, and to me, there is some common sense about it, and especially if there's no evidence that sequencing on a more gradual basis over the course of infancy, the the um, the shots that they need reduces their immunity in some kind of way, then I think a more gradual protocol would make a lot of sense as a conservative approach.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you just have to start weighing the business aspect too. So it's not that doctors' offices and hospitals are thinking about necessarily just the child's well-being, because if that were true, we would also be having more regular check-ins. We would be,
Absolutely.
have more personalized care. We'd be meeting with a doctor for more than 15 minutes. But they're thinking about, expediency and efficiency, and having 2 15-minute doctor's appointments costs a
I
lot
don't know
more.
if it's the doctors or the insurance companies,
Yeah.
because if somebody comes for a visit, to get inoculated,
Yeah.
and they get 5 shots, for example, or 5 different pathogens,
Yeah.
then the insurance company has to reimburse for 1 doctor visit for
Mhm.
that child. Whereas, let's say it was 6 and you divided it over into 3
Yeah.
appointments, the insurance company would have to pay for 3 doctor's appointments, and you
Yeah.
multiply that by millions of infants
Yeah.
who are being reimbursed by these third-party payers. And I wonder if the driving force for these protocols are the insurance companies.
It's likely true.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Likely true.
yeah. I mean, I'm past the young baby phase, I guess, until grandchildren. But if I was, in that phase, I would probably insist, to the extent that I could, in a more gradual, protocol.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
what I ended up doing. Not because I was concerned about development of autism, mainly
Yeah.
just for management of my child's pain in the moment.
The other thing, I thought of one more thing in terms of the etiology and how you could perhaps link things that are going on in society to a higher uh, uh, incidence, would be the amount of screen time
Mhm.
as opposed to physical connection that is going on in our society.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know if you've seen all these statistics on the amount of screen time that infants and toddlers are having,
Yeah.
iPads connected to their walkers, and
Yeah.
digital busy boxes in the crib. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, with everything in behavioral intervention too, practice makes perfect, right? So the more productive and maybe even supervised social opportunities you have, the better you become at interacting with your peers. So if screen time is impacting the amount of time that you're spending with peers and the positive time that you're spending with peers, and the development of those skills and the supported situations, then I could see there being risk for greater impairment. It's not to say that it wouldn't, I mean, we've talked about autism being a neurodevelopmental disorder, so you are at risk from birth, but it would impact your level of practice with skills.
Yeah, so let's say you found some really, let's say you had a child and there was a genetic marker for autism,
Mhm.
or that you saw signs of not meeting certain social and emotional milestones in infancy. Because I imagine there are things like eye contact that may raise some red flags.
Mhm.
Are there interventions, early interventions, where you could do sort of mass um, social skills training, mass kind of human attachment work that
The
help it?
the early intervention is very time and not time, I don't want to say time intensive, it's very expensive because it's one-to-one intervention. So with later intervention and social skills training in late elementary, middle school, high school, the model is, for most kids on the spectrum, is like a group model, so you're learning about
I meant with
skills.
the parent. In other words, let's say you go to your pediatrician. The child's a few months old, and if there were any kind of very simple tests, like can the baby, follow your gaze? Do they make eye contact? I don't know what measures they would use,
Yeah.
but that's some things that might be predictive of these deficits later on.
Yeah, so the earliest literature has talked about early predictors at a year, but they
Here.
aren't necessarily going to guarantee that a child's going to develop. So there's huge variability in the first couple of years of life and rate of development of both motor skill, language skill, social skills. So there are some kids who are just a little bit developmentally delayed, not even, they wouldn't even meet criteria for developmental delay. It's just there's
You could see a little developmental delay and it'd be really just a maturational lag or a slow
yes.
development and not really be a signal for any kind of underlying issues.
Yeah. So there are definitely some signs, and depending on the severity of those signs at 12 months, that increase the likelihood that you'll receive a diagnosis. So the earliest we can make diagnosis is 2 years.
But what would
And
you say, let's say you said 12 months, you start, seeing things that may, alert your attention. What would you
yeah, so
do with
if
the
by
baby?
12 months you're not orienting to your name, you aren't sharing gaze, you're not showing things to your caregiver, you're not pointing, those have been found to be some signs, among others, that you may be at risk.
What
Those are
about,
skills that typically come online much earlier, but 12 months is kind of the cutoff. If you haven't developed these by now, you might be referred.
so those are more social kind of
Yeah.
markers. What
Yeah.
about emotional expression? Kids with,
Flat affect, no, because there's a huge variability in affect still.
right,
At 12 months, some kids are just more stoic.
right,
So
temperamental, you're saying,
yeah,
right.
some kids are still really distressed. The first year of life is really hard for babies, right? They're learning
Yeah.
so many things. They're processing their environment. They're skill acquisition is crazy. So there are just huge temperamental differences. So that there aren't really temperamental questions around that 12-month period. Most of the questions have to do with social communication. That's unrelated to temperament.
Okay.
Mhm.
So let's move on from the more biology, of it and causes of it,
Mhm.
and try to bring the students into those more the cognitive perspectives on autism and what the mental experience might be.
Mhm. So are you thinking about like cognitive theories of autism? Are you thinking about how kind of self-advocates describe their personal experience? What are you?
A little bit. I mean the cognitive theories, but I would imagine that those would have a parallel in the experience of
Mhm.
the people who have it, or they're not very good theories.
Yes.
Like for example, the stuff that you were mentioning in the class that I visited
Mhm.
on,
Okay.
theories of mind,
Yeah.
cognitive coherence, executive function, that kind of.
Mhm. Yeah, so the cognitive models that we have are meant to kind of bridge the relationship between what's happening in the brain and behavior. So cognitive theories are designed to try and explain behavior. The problem with the cognitive theories of autism is that there's no single cognitive theory that explains everything that we see in terms of behavior and the phenotype associated with autism.
Yeah.
There are three kind of major cognitive theories, like you said, executive function, something called central coherence, and also theory of mind. So executive function is related to our ability to pursue kind of goal-directed behavior. A lot of kids and adults on the spectrum exhibit weaknesses in certain areas of executive function, including cognitive flexibility and planning. Kids who have a comorbid diagnosis of ADHD, and about 40% of individuals with autism have also a diagnosis of ADHD, are more likely to experience struggles with executive function. But executive function, a theory of executive function, doesn't really explain the social communication deficits that we see. Central coherence, that theory talks about the ability to see the forest for the trees. So some of us are very, very skilled at seeing very, very minute details. So those would be the people who excel in coding, computer programming, right? Because you can debug almost anything.
Mhm.
There's a particular skill in being able to see and understand very fine detail. But we also need people who can see the big picture and be able to process what the big picture means and how it relates to something else. So central coherence theory states that individuals on the spectrum are more likely to be better at seeing the minutia and the fine detail.
You know,
What we
I,
know is that that's definitely not true for every individual on the spectrum.
yeah.
There are some who are really good at seeing the big picture. So it um, it
So,
also
so,
that theory. Go ahead.
so someone who has deficits in
Mhm.
executive function, may not have deficits in central cognitive coherence.
Yeah, and it totally also depends on the area of executive function where you're exhibiting weaknesses too. Some areas of executive function I would expect to be more related to central coherence than others. So things like cognitive flexibility would probably be more related to central coherence, whereas planning deficits would probably not be super related to central coherence. So it kind of depends on the domain of executive function also.
Right. And then the third one was theory of mind.
Yeah, so theory of mind is basically this idea of being able to mentalize, so putting yourself in somebody else's shoes.
Mhm.
Um, we are all narcissistic to some extent, right? Some of us more so than others. We're, especially professors, very narcissistic guys. We just see our perspective. Um, we are good at understanding how situations impact us. It's much, much more difficult to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and think about how the situation might impact them and what their emotional response is going to be and their cognitive
You're,
response
you're
to
breaking up a
situations.
little
So
bit.
theory of mind is that the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes.
Alex, you're breaking up a little. Oh, it's my
Oh, it should
internet
go back.
connection is a little
Yes,
funky there. Okay, I think we're okay.
unstable. Okay.
Um, so
Yes.
I maybe you addressed this already, but I didn't really hear this. It was about the independence versus interrelation of these three cognitive abilities of executive function, central coherence, and theory of mind or mentalization.
Yeah. So how interrelated they are.
Yeah.
They're pretty distinct. um, what's interesting is that researchers have a lot of researchers kind of have their camp in one of those cognitive areas. So they're not doing a lot of research between those areas. Some researchers have looked at the relationship between executive function and theory of mind and found very little overlap. So there is not a lot of support for shared deficits across these different areas. So meaning if you are weak in theory of mind, we know you're going to be weak in executive function. That's not true. We haven't found that to be true. So what we know is that they do explain very distinct areas of the deficits that we see in autism. So yes, cognitive theories are evolving.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I have, well, anyway, let's try to now bridge, if we could, from the cognitive theories and the biological
Mm-hmm.
basis of it and cultural basis of it. Let's talk a little bit about intervention.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that that is a different meaning at different developmental stages.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could touch upon, early childhood, then more, middle and adolescence. And then I'd like to talk with you a little bit about an adult client that I'm actually working with now who is on the spectrum, and some of the issues that I'm seeing with him right now.
Sounds good. Okay, so the evolution of intervention. So early intervention is one-to-one with a therapist. There are also forms of early intervention called parent-mediated intervention, where a therapist teaches the parent those skills and the parent tries to practice at home with the child.
Yeah.
Most of those early interventions are play-based. So we know that play is an important precursor to social communication and social development. So a lot of showing is happening during play, a lot of shared attention is happening during play. So many of those early interventions are built around playing with the child and trying to encourage language through play. These are evidence-based interventions. There are very intense protocols. So it's not like, let's just play and we're just going to see what happens. There's very specific instructions about prompting of language and how to model language and then try and get a child to respond to such language. So with early intervention also, there are interventions that are more naturalistic. So things surrounding play, for example, would be an example of more naturalistic. We expect kids to be able to play, so we want to improve their ability to play. There's also early interventions that are more grounded in something called applied behavior analysis. So discrete trial training is one example of a very ABA, applied behavioral analysis approach to intervention, which is basically you are giving the child trials of concepts or language, vocabulary you want them to master. So you would present them with a card and ask them to identify what was on the card. You would do that over and over and over again until they achieve great master. What we know is the play-based interventions are more likely to help development of social communication, and the more ABA, applied behavior analysis, or strictly ABA interventions are more likely to improve cognitive ability. So cognitive ability, you're mostly asked to do things like define vocabulary, identify pictures. So it's natural that the generalization from discrete trials to a cognitive assessment would be closer than from a play-based assessment to a cognitive. So that's early intervention. That is through about age 8. When you start to get around age 8 or even younger, sometimes preschool, depending on the child's level of language, you start to move into social skills training. So training of what to do in what appropriate social responses to give in certain situations, and also how to best initiate social interactions, how to act around your peers, things like that. So training around social situations. And that's usually happening in groups. Parents are usually learning about the same skills so they can encourage that skill use in their child. And that is essentially the intervention model, that social skills training that's happening through adulthood. So we move from early intervention, which is a one-to-one therapist model, either therapist or parent-mediated model, to a social skills training model, where you're in a group setting.
Yeah. And then with adults, does anything change from the are there any additional interventions with adults?
So the interventions that are different for adults is more specific training around adult and daily living skills. So things that you're not expected to do necessarily for yourself when you're living with your parent, that you have to be able to manage independently. If you are living independently, you need specific training in. So what we know about autism is kids on the spectrum in general have a difficulty with generalization. So they learn something in a clinic setting and it's really hard for them to go and apply that skill in a novel situation. They can apply it superbly in the clinic, but when presented with something that's tweaked a little bit even in their environment, they're not able to apply the same skill. So you have to teach very directly and use like very direct use of the skills.
Right, right.
So yes, around daily life, you hear my child crying.
Yeah. You want to take a break?
um, let's see, what time is it? No, because we're almost done. He might just.
Yeah, well, maybe 10 minutes and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Or maybe he should just make a guest appearance. I'm just gonna grab him.
Yeah.
I'll grab him real fast.
Okay.
Baba Boo! Baba Boo! Here, I can hold him. Mommy's Zoom chat, okay? You're gonna make a guest appearance on Mommy's Zoom chat. Okay.
There he is.
This is my child.
Hello.
This is Owen. That's Rich. He just woke up from a nap. I said Owen just woke up from a nap. Rich did not just wake up from a nap.
Yes, I'm going to have my nap later.
Nap, he gets distressed. So.
All right. Okay.
So he'll just be here.
Okay. Good. So
Guys, parenting in real life.
Exactly. So let me tell you about this this man that I'm seeing now, who's clearly on the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
On the so he's actually today is his 30th birthday.
Oh, no way. You just went out there. It's okay.
I just realized that.
Oh.
Yeah, interesting day to have this interview.
I know.
Yeah. I've been seeing him for about 6 months.
Yeah.
And basically, he was misdiagnosed for most of his life.
Yeah.
Comes from a very rural area in New England that doesn't have a lot of services, or sophisticated professionals. And basically, he was just told that he had a learning disability and maybe some ADHD, this kind of thing. And so he went through a lot of, LD work, and none of it touched the, more pervasive issues of cognition and social difficulty that he had.
Yeah.
He has a family of considerable means, so they were propping him up and, sending him to special schools and things like that. Even after a year of being in a special school for learning disabilities, was able to go to a 4-year college and make it through for about a year, which is extraordinary to me.
Yeah.
I found out that there were 2 things that enabled him to move forward. On an academic level, he had a quote unquote writing tutor who was supposed to help him, with his writing. And he has major central coherence issues. You talk about not being able to see the forest for the trees. He would get a paper assignment and not really be able to, he's very smart and his mind is, very curious and interesting. And he would read and have all these thoughts and begin to write. but you can imagine how indecipherable it was. And he
Yeah.
would write for a 20-page paper, he would write like 100 pages.
Yeah.
And it was to say to him that you have to organize this in some linear, coherent way
Hmm.
was a form of torture.
Yes.
Uh, there's no way, in God's earth that he'd ever be able to do this.
Yeah.
And this writing instructor, rather than, giving him specific instruction in how to do a topic sentence or make a transitional sentence at the end, which a lot of his tutors would do, realized that this was like an impossibility, that
Yeah.
the bar was just beyond him. And without really saying anything, he would have the person hand over the extraordinary amount of information, and he would essentially write the paper.
Yeah.
And you know, he was getting by with
Yeah.
the assistance of this person.
Yes.
And then the person had to leave,
Oh.
and basically he, fell apart.
Hmm.
The other thing that might interest you and fascinates me about him
Hmm.
is that he is a world-class road biker.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And he is aware that the thing that allows him to be very good at road biking is that it controls his coherence issue. When
Hmm.
you start at point A and you ride for 50 miles and you get to point B,
Hmm.
and you can't go too far off the track, and
Yeah.
the linearity of experience is imposed upon him. And
Hmm.
he finds that incredibly comforting.
Yes.
And it's the one area that he can excel and and uh, and do okay,
Hmm.
within a social situation as well, because he is so knowledgeable about road.
Yeah. So when you're talking to world-class road bikers, all they want to talk about is racing, right? So it's totally socially appropriate to talk about this area.
Yeah, yeah. Now he has many interests. He's
Hmm.
a junkie for philosophy
Hmm.
videos.
Yeah.
He can talk about all these philosophers in great detail. He likes, really um, esoteric, astronomical kinds of theories about the universe, etc.
Yeah.
So he's an incredibly interesting human being,
Yeah.
and filled with knowledge, but it's a kind of nuclear explosion in his mind.
Yeah.
So the problem has been, and I'd be interested in your thoughts about this. The problem has been, other than road biking, which he's not good enough and not really willing to take a sufficient amount of steroids to
Yeah.
be to make a living at it, that
Yeah.
which only the upper echelon of people can do.
Yeah.
Um, so it can't be his life's work, and there's almost nothing that he can do that he has the ability to organize himself um, sufficiently in order to adapt to the world.
Yeah.
He once said to me, and I'll stop with this, that if he gets no structure, he goes off the deep end.
Yeah.
But if he gets too much structure, the level of things that he has to follow
Hmm.
become too complicated
Yeah.
for him. So
Yeah.
there's a very small band between no structure and too much structure
Hmm.
that he can operate in. And there's almost no place in the world where that band exists.
Yes. Yeah. So
It's
this is one of the
heartbreaking, really.
reasons why a lot of individuals on the spectrum are what's called underemployed. So they've gone to college or have an associate's degree, yet are working in like recycling facilities because um, places of employment don't have the adequate resources to support them in the way that they need in order to excel in a particular position. You also don't wear a shirt that says I have autism and I need accommodation in the following areas and workplaces,
That's
employment.
actually one of the things that I've been working with him, in terms of him being able to understand what his challenges are,
Yeah,
and to, instead of trying to hide them, that he is upfront about some accommodations that he would need in order to be able to do well in a
yeah.
particular job.
Yeah, and those accommodations exist, and they exist under ADA. It's just there's been way less research and development around accommodations for adults on the spectrum and what's needed in order to excel. This is also why your family's income level has a huge amount to do with your future success, because it takes a huge amount of help from your parents to navigate where you are best and what you're going to be able to do, and also a lot of insight and knowledge on the part of the parents.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So if you don't have that form of advocate, it's hard for you as an adult on the spectrum to figure out, well, what are my skills? What is a match for, what kind of career is a match for that skill set? Am I interested in that career? And is it possible for me to hold down employment in that area? So a lot of, and I think you have probably a lot of seniors in your class who are struggling right now to think, what am I going to do? Imagine that you have even more on your plate that might impact your decision about what you're going to do, and how confusing that can be. So,
yeah.
um,
Very fortunate in the sense that his father is a very successful businessman,
yeah,
and the father has some features, let's say. I wouldn't say that most people would say he's on the spectrum, but he has very mild kinds of
yes,
symptoms. But the father recognizes, you know, um, some of his qualities in a more exaggerated way,
yeah,
with his son, and feels very guilty and is willing basically to support him
yeah,
in any reasonable way. He wants his son to work hard and to maximize his ability, in the world, and to have a fulfilling and capable life as he can have.
yeah,
And the son, fortunately, is a hard worker and
mhm,
is courageous and diligent and is trying. But it's, as you can imagine, he runs into roadblocks,
yeah.
and it's very, very difficult for him.
Yeah. And what's interesting is work-based learning experiences in high school, for example, are like singly most predictive of gainful employment after graduation from high school. So it's also not necessarily that your first job is going to be what you're going to do for the rest of your life, but a first job teaches you what it means to be a part of a workplace, right? So there are a lot of skills and social skills that have to be developed around um, working in, or just working period, and working with coworkers. So those employment experiences are very, very important. And there's new areas of research around developing social skills around employment, and then job coaches, for example, facilitating transition to employment.
Right. The only job he's been able to have, and this is with some difficulty, was working within a Goodwill store.
Yeah.
People would come and shop for, very cheap goods, or,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. That was about the best he could do.
Yeah.
And I bet that he has well above
Oh, yeah.
average intelligence. So it's very humiliating to him
Yep.
as well. It's a it's a
Yeah.
cruel disorder, really.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard also because you don't look at a person and know they have autism and know the degree of their struggles. So people expect a lot. And I tell a lot of kids in the class, or my students in the class, this, and this applies not just to autism, but imagine that you are having a lot going on in your life at the same time. So you fail an exam, your parents are upset with you, you're having financial aid issues, you're worried about what your career is going to be after you graduate, you're not able to find a summer internship, the economy collapses. So imagine all of these things are happening to you at the same time, and how that might impact your ability to get a job and to be able to function independently,
Yeah,
right? So the same is true for kids and adults with neurodevelopmental disorders. It's just those things that are piling on them might be a little bit different. So I describe that as a way to think about kind of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and understanding that everybody's experience is different. And for some people, it takes a lot more energy, a lot more effort, and a lot more resources to get to the same point.
Yeah.
And that's not because they have any less cognitive capacity. It's just because of the kind of things stacked against them, the environmental
Yeah,
factors stacked against them.
until they have a clear understanding of what they're up against, um, there's fertile ground for a dual diagnosis situation. For example, um, because he had trouble socially, but is really a social person, has quite a big heart, you
Yeah.
know. So his theory of mind kinds of capacities are there. It's more on the executive function and the
Yeah.
coherence, issues that he struggles with.
Yeah.
Um, and so he made bad choices in social relations.
Yeah.
He would sometimes, um, get very depressed. So there was a mood disorder
Yeah.
about feeling like a failure
Yeah.
compared to siblings and his parents' station.
Yeah.
And sometimes he would overuse drugs and alcohol, and was once arrested for a DUI and had court issues,
Yeah.
all secondary to his struggles in terms of dealing with a disorder that he knew he had but didn't quite understand.
Yeah. Yes. And this is definitely not uncommon.
For these dual diagnosis situations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're trying to find ways to cope when you haven't been given the adequate resources to do so. So that might mean substance use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, you look at this and you think you have a family that is very understanding.
Mm-hmm.
A family has a lot of resources. Somebody who's done a lot of work on himself and has a lot of self-knowledge now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think has let himself off the hook a lot.
Yeah.
And has controlled some of his damaging coping mechanisms,
Mm-hmm.
but it really hasn't touched the core deficits and challenges, which seem really on some level at this point intractable.
Yeah. And, a huge part of it is also fit. Like, I feel like our go-to, or as a society, is okay, I need a job. Let it be like in retail, for example. I can get a retail job. Well, a retail job is probably the worst fit for an individual on the spectrum. You're expected to interact with people socially. You're expected to be able to sell product. You're expected to be able to follow rules, and engage your executive functions and do things and predict what your boss is expecting of you and to go the extra mile. So these are all things that somebody is not going to be good at if they're struggling with social deficits and executive function as well. So a huge part of it is also finding a match. And there are organizations that are working to do that. And there are organizations in LA that are working to do that too.
Yeah. And I think, and we can wrap up in a minute. Owen's been amazing. He's been,
He just needs a co-presence.
Yeah, great. He's great.
But his dad's in the background too. So
I see. Okay.
He looks over.
It's a village video.
Daddy. Daddy is here.
Right. So I forget what I was saying. Let's see.
I just talked about retail jobs being a really poor.
Oh yeah. He had a job in a pizza parlor.
Yeah.
There was a disaster.
No, disaster. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, what we've been working on now is some work with ACT, a kind of acceptance model.
Yes. Yeah.
And also reinforcing the talents that he does have, which are considerable too.
Yeah.
And talking about the situation that maybe, a capitalist culture and is not it's going to be difficult to find a position within the work culture that we have that is a good match for your interesting kind of mind. It's not, you're not really suited in many ways to the way the world works, at least the economy. But at the same time, you have, a big heart, you like people, you have many interests
Mm-hmm.
on a physical level and a intellectual level.
Yeah.
So maybe that you have to do something very simple
Mm-hmm.
and let yourself off the hook, be okay with that, and then find other places in society that you fit into, and that's a life that you consider to be fulfilling and worthwhile.
Yeah. And one recommendation I made to parents also is that you want to find a job that is very tolerant of your child. So, industries where you know there is a greater degree of tolerance. So, for example, like a school setting, if you make it through a year or 2 years of probation, you can't be fired, basically. So, you got to make it for a year or 2 years. You have to pass probation, and then you're in a situation where you have gainful employment and a pension, basically, when you retire. So, it's it's hard because the parents have to change the way they're thinking about what their child's future looks like from how.
I'm exploring with him some kind of employment, because he doesn't have to make a lot of money.
Yeah.
If his parents just felt that he had something that he was doing, in his life that was constructive, he doesn't need a lot of money, which is his great advantage,
Yeah.
family context. But I think that there might be something where he could volunteer to teach road biking
Hmm.
to a particular segment of society in middle school or high school or something. And
Hmm.
he wouldn't really have to be paid that much, but he would be like a road biking coach.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I mean, there's so many possibilities, but yeah, my recommendation to parents is something where there's a tolerant employer and you have job security, basically. And your success in that job is not dependent on your social skills and your social ability, that your work can kind of stand alone.
Yeah.
Um, and if a person excels, and this is not necessarily a fit for every autistic person, but if a person excels in like engineering, for example, there is not a lot of expectation in engineering industries that you're going to be super socially fluent. So
Right.
as long as you can get your work done and within the bounds set forth by your boss, then you're going to be okay. So um, yeah.
Except you have the central coherence kind of.
Yes, so that's only if you're a fit and that's an
Yeah.
area where you
That
excel.
central coherence thing is really, really tough.
Yes, it
You
is.
can work around the social stuff. You can even the executive function in a very narrow band of work.
Yeah.
But the central coherence is just the basic organization of thought.
Yeah, and that's actually those are kind of two separate things. So central coherence would be like reading comprehension is more
I think.
impacted versus the combination, which is reading comprehension and then executive function organization. So organization in terms of executive function isn't just organization of your physical environment, it's also
Okay,
mental
awesome. Well,
organization of ideas.
that is,
Um,
yeah, that's a big area of impairment.
yeah.
That one's really tough.
Yep. And it's really, really hard to work on that. Organization is something that's really hard
Yeah.
because you're constantly being challenged with novel scenarios. So, whereas like in a physical environment, you can teach habits that can help a person to stay organized. If you're trying to teach mental organization, it's difficult.
It's very difficult. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I really want to thank you for spending the time to do this, and especially that you were able to, give us some academic, and developmental perspective,
Mhm.
but then also to make the jump into a kind of a clinical situation that a therapist may encounter, such as the client that I'm working with. I'm sure most therapists at this point will have clients who are on the spectrum and adults and are facing a lot of these issues that we've talked about in terms of this client. And because this is a class in clinical psychology, and that we have a little bit more of an adult focus than a child and adolescent focus,
Yeah.
I think this was a really good case, for the students to
To
hear
listen
how
to.
this is.
Yeah. And one thing I also want to highlight, and you can say whether or not this is true for you,
Yeah,
there are a lot of individuals on the spectrum who do have a relatively flat affect. It can look kind of disengaged and disinterested in therapy. And a
yeah,
lot of therapists will take a hard line. You have to work to be here. And if you're not willing to work, you can't be here.
right.
But this potential motivation issue can be very hard for individuals on the spectrum. So there are a lot of therapists who will not work with individuals on the spectrum as a result. So I applaud you for doing the hard work and seeing the best in your client, because there are many therapists who would say, no, you can't be here. This isn't working.
Yeah, yeah. I like him. I think
Yeah.
he's a good person. I think he has a good heart. I think
Yeah.
he likes people, and in and I am just acutely aware of how difficult his situation is
Yeah.
when I put myself in his shoes.
Yes. Good theory of mind.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So thank you again, and maybe I can stop the recording and we can talk just very briefly about one of the departmental things we need to address.
Sure. Great.
Okay, thank you
Thanks,
so
Rich.
much.
Bye, guys.
Okay,
Say
all
bye,
right.
Hoey.
Stop the
He said
recording
bye. Yeah.
now. Here we are.